On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on étre paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 22, Early Christianity and Late Paganism. At the time of Constantine, when Christianity became the religion of an empire, a practically unique event in the annals of history occurred. In the words of Jean Blot, an empire, for its own survival, changed its foundation, the same on which the Christian West would expand, adopted a foreign religion, or to be more precise, but this qualification changes nothing, a heresy of a foreign religion. Christianity is interpreted here in the standard way as a gradually westernized dissident form of Judaism. Others have seen it, in a more original vein, as a form of Gnosticism, that is to say, an anti-Judaic faith that gradually became more Judaic. Whatever the case may be, the fact remains that Christianization triggered a whole process of European pseudomorphosis, which caused a certain number of interactions that ultimately led to the creation of a hybrid religious category. Once Europe had become Christianized, neither Europe nor Christianity conformed any more to their origins and their own natures. To a certain extent, Christianity has, at least for the time being, changed European man, but, as noted by Spengler in The Decline of the West, European man has also changed Christianity, also perhaps only for the time being. This was also noted by Nietzsche. It appears hardly possible to transplant with lasting success a foreign myth without irremediably damaging the tree by this transplant. Europe gave its adherence to a Christianity that it had already influenced to the point of no longer being what it originally was. Absolute monotheism, in its dualistic form, was profoundly foreign to the European mind. Christianity represented the composite, intermediary form necessary for its acclimatization. As Alfred Loisy rightly noted, it was, on the one hand, by tempering monotheism with the gnosis of the Trinitarian dogma, and on the other, by identifying Jesus with God, that Christianity made the doctrine of the one God acceptable to the pagan world. The one God was only accepted in Europe because he became one God in three persons, by integrating the old Trinity that the Vedic Indians called Trimurt. It also required that this God be embodied, that he be endowed with a human face, and that, subsequently, the Father of this God-made man could also be depicted in human form. This process was certainly a reversal of the one familiar to the pagan world. It was not a man who ascended to the status of a god but a god who made himself a man. But at least the appearance was there. So while one can read in the Bible, "I am God and not man," Hosea 11:9, Christianity proposed the apparently familiar face of a son who was embodied and at the same time consubstantial with the eternal Father. Thus certain conditions for acclimatization were made possible. European peasants, says Mircea Eliade, could only eventually find communion with Christian theology by transforming Christ into a bearded God who lived and worked like them. This observation has been made on numerous occasions, both for the sake of rejoicing and bemoaning it. As for paganism, writes Maurice Bellet, it is not at all so sure that Christianity simply succeeded it. In certain cases, the latter is only a Christian coating over an old and forgotten religious patrimony that has in fact remained unchanged, with its myths and superstitions. It is by basing their argument on this observation that a number of authors have been able to claim that Europe has never been truly Christian, although it was, here and there at certain times, permeated by a faith that officially claimed to be Christianity. They also maintain that today, when churches are emptying and religious vocations are mute, the opposite is true, and that Judeo-Christian values are much more deeply established in hearts and minds. We will revisit this point again later. The conversion of Europe to Christianity was therefore largely a sham, as Erich Fromm has written. An opinion that is perfectly valid in fact to maintain, on the condition that this sham is located at the level of a collective unconscious gradually but lucidly admitting its desire to either emancipate itself from the Christian heritage or, conversely, in complete awareness, to join it with even greater force. This syncretism took place, and nothing could have prevented it from taking place. It is very hard for Christianity today to abolish its own history, whatever the desire may be of some of its representatives in this regard. Conversely, even if paganism could have been the naturalist religion, an opinion I do not share, depicted by Christianity, and which certain neo-pagans have naively attempted to reactivate, its rebirth and reappropriation would exclude this kind of integral resumption in the form of repetition. Post-Christianity cannot be an ad integrium return, it cannot be the simple restoration of what once was. In evoking, with Heidegger, the perspective of another beginning, I have already defined what I mean by other. A new paganism must be truly new. To surpass Christianity demands both the reactualization of its before and the appropriation of its after. It is, negatively, not by grace but on the occasion of their conversion to Christianity that Europeans were able to acquire a clear awareness that they did not specifically belong to nature, that they possessed a constitutive supernature and could acquire another by making the transition from human to superhuman. It was through this circumstance that they were able to fully feel like historical beings. But this was also the circumstance that let them interpret Judeo-Christian monotheism as a radical attempt to develop a negative anthropology by means of a negative theology, as a desperate, radical attempt to prevent man from bestowing upon himself a supernature by pairing the world with an anti-world, nature with an anti-nature, and by asserting the existence of an absolute mastery that renders all human masteries futile and by which all human freedom will eventually be subjugated. This attempt cannot be abolished, because as part of our past it is also part of our present, but it can be surpassed. The way in which Judeo-Christian monotheism has posed the question of man's relationship with his own history, and his own historicity, demands, on its own, that one actually moves on beyond this problematic. The return to before is unworkable. Just as it needs to leave behind all naturalism, cease to identify with standards and averages, and rethink the articulation of ethics between what is and what should be according to a given plan, neo-paganism must take into account history, whose notion has been conceptualized by Judeo-Christian monotheism, not to assign it now a sole, unique end, but to make it the ever-plural result of a will that is ceaselessly reoriented in new directions. For the same reason, neo-paganism must also represent the pagan system of values in a form that is not simply the antithesis of Judeo-Christian monotheism. Buddha's emphasis on the primacy of action resulted from his confrontation with a thought that held God as at work in history. The paganism of the future will be a Faustian paganism. Furthermore, pagan thought under Christianity had already begun to evolve before it seemingly died. 4th century paganism had three fulcrums. The first was the ancient aristocracy that was pagan by tradition, aus maiorum, the ancestral custom, and patriotism. Rome will live as long as its gods. The second fulcrum were the high officials who protested against the Easternization of the empire and the despotism of the imperial regime. See, for example, the matter of the victory altar, whose return was demanded by Symmachus under Valentinian it. The third, finally, were the schools, as is demonstrated by the education of Julian, the importance of Libanius to Nicomedia, then to Antioch, and so on. This paganism can be sometimes devout, sometimes quite intellectualized and philosophical. The other constituent elements of the new religiosity are the rise of the imperial cult, the progress of Christianity, and the influx of Oriental cults. Now what is interesting here is that, when confronted with this new situation, the partisans of paganism seem to rethink their system and offer a new formulation. Contrary to what is in fact written far too often, the one God who was generally claimed by the last phase of Greco-Roman paganism is in no way comparable to the God of Judeo-Christian monotheism. Far from being radically distinct from the gods of the traditional pantheon, it represents their common principle. Far from forming an absolute that is entirely separate from the world, it is identical to the world's very being. Stoicism, whose religious foundations are essential, constitutes a significant case in this regard. The Stoics' God is the soul of the world. The cosmos is a living being full of wisdom. The logos that furnishes it its information is entirely consubstantial to it. It is incorporated into the itinerary and very substance of the cosmos. There is no hinterwelt, no world beyond. The universe is not dependent upon another being, and it is in this world that man must realize his ideal. When the Stoics speak of the world's duality, by accepting, for example, the Pythagorean opposition between the celestial world, which is the perfect world of the stars to which souls belong, and the terrestrial, sublunary world, it only involves a substantial opposition within a Unitarian world. Wisdom and virtue consist of living according to the order of this universe. Even better, the cosmos, insofar as it contains the totality of beings, is absolutely perfect, therefore nothing can remain outside of it. This last paganism remained faithful to the principle of tolerance. For cultivated pagans, it was precisely because they represented the different faces of the same deity that all the gods are equally respectable, whereas the Christians, who never stopped regarding the gods of pagans as idols, demons, and even, as Martin de Braga writes, thought ancient deified figures to be extremely evil men and rogues. Paradoxically, E.R. Dodds reminds us that in Origen's polemic against Celsus, it was believed that Celsus was a monotheist of greater consequence than Origen, because he considered as blasphemous the way the Christians placed another god on the same plane as the supreme God. If all the gods are only in fact emanations of one unique God, how could they compete with him? The Stoics, while they maintained the idea of a unique God, also accepted the existence and anthropomorphic representation of minor gods and confined themselves to giving them allegorical or symbolic interpretations. For example, They explained Zeus as a representation of the eternal principle by which all things exist and become, and made the other gods particular attributes of this principle. Julian the Apostate himself, when he restored solar worship, took pains to point out that, beyond the physical sun, it was the sun of divine intellect, for which the star was only an epiphany, that he worshipped. Diogenes Laertius wrote, God, intelligence, destiny, Zeus are one sole being, and he is still given yet several other names. Maximus of Tyre asserted, for his part, that the Greeks simultaneously supported two truths. The first is that there is only one sole God, King and Father of all. The second is that there are numerous gods, children of God, who share his power. Perhaps this is also how we should retrospectively interpret the belief of Heraclitus that the law is to obey the will of the one and that the one, which alone is wisdom, suffers and does not suffer to be called Zeus. At the world of antiquity was sinking, paganism was therefore evolving considerably. If it referred at times to a unique God, it was not in the sense of Judeo-Christianity. More than a stricto sensu monotheism, it was a Unitarian pantheism, professing that the deity was the soul of the world, in the sense that Plato speaks of a tangible God, or, if you prefer, a henotheistic syncretism, making a pantheistic God from a supreme principle, for whom the other gods are hypostases. This paganism is characterized on the ideological plane by the interpenetration of specifically religious and philosophical elements. It was not given time to establish itself and was condemned to gradually disappear. Left to its own devices and spared Christian infection, perhaps the whole of European paganism may have evolved in this direction. It is in this sense that one can subscribe to Loisy's opinion. Greco-Roman paganism has undergone many changes and alterations during the course of its existence, but to the end it remained a polytheistic religion. It ceded its place to Christian monotheism, being incapable of either absorbing it or transforming it, or even incorporating it, at least directly, by transforming itself.